August 1st, 1943, 6:30 in the morning, 200 feet above the ground, somewhere over southern Romania. 178 American B-24 Liberator bombers moved east in tight formation. Each aircraft carried between 2,000 and 3,000 pounds of high explosive and incendiary bombs. Their engines ran at maximum power, holding altitude just above treetops, rail lines, and wheat fields. The mission target lay ahead: the oil refineries of Ploiesti, one of the most critical industrial complexes in the entire Axis war machine. At this moment, nearly one-third of all petroleum used by Nazi Germany came from these refineries. Aviation gasoline, diesel fuel for armored divisions, lubricants for tank engines, and fuel oil for transport trucks all moved through the pipelines of Ploiesti. Without this fuel, German armored formations could not maneuver. Luftwaffe aircraft could not fly sustained missions. Panzer divisions would become stationary steel. The Allied strategic planners knew this. Inside the lead bomber of the 376th Bomb Group, Colonel Keith K. Compton studied the map clipped to his control panel. The formation had departed from airfields near Benghazi, Libya, earlier that morning, shortly after midnight. The flight to Romania covered more than 1,200 miles. Unlike traditional high-altitude bombing missions, this operation required an extremely dangerous approach: low-level attack. The aircraft would strike at rooftop height to avoid radar detection and to deliver precise bomb placement against refinery cracking towers, storage tanks, and pumping stations. At 7:15 in the morning, the formation crossed the Danube River. Navigation was already becoming difficult. Dust from the dry fields reduced visibility. The low altitude forced pilots to constantly avoid telephone wires, smokestacks, and railway signals. In the navigator seat of a bomber from the 93rd Bomb Group, Lieutenant Lloyd Hughes monitored the route using visual landmarks rather than radio beacons. Radio silence had been ordered to maintain surprise, but a problem had already begun to develop. Just before the Danube crossing, the lead formation made a navigation error. Instead of turning toward the correct attack corridor west of Ploiesti, several bomber groups drifted north toward the city itself. This mistake broke the carefully planned attack sequence. The mission plan depended on 5 separate bomb groups striking 5 refinery complexes simultaneously. The targets included the Astra Romana refinery, the Columbia Aquila refinery, the Unirea Orion refinery, the Steaua Romana refinery, the Romana Americana refinery. Each refinery had a different industrial function. Some specialized in aviation gasoline distillation. Others produced lubricants and diesel fuels. Destroying them together would cause a catastrophic collapse of Axis fuel production. But the navigational split meant the bombers would arrive in staggered waves instead of a coordinated strike. German defenses were already waiting. Romanian and German engineers had spent months reinforcing the region. Around the refineries stood 88mm Flak 36 anti-aircraft guns, the same weapons used to destroy Allied tanks in North Africa. Heavy batteries were supported by 37mm and 20mm automatic cannons positioned on rooftops, railway yards, and factory platforms. Even more dangerous were the camouflaged gun pits hidden between storage tanks and pipelines. Because the American bombers were flying at extremely low altitude, these weapons would fire direct line of sight. The moment the first bomber crossed the refinery perimeter, every gun crew would see its target clearly. At 7:37 in the morning, the first formation reached the outskirts of Ploiesti. Smokestacks appeared on the horizon. Pipelines ran like metal veins across the industrial district. Massive cylindrical storage tanks stretched for miles. Colonel Jacob Smart, one of the planners of the mission, had warned the crews before takeoff. At low altitude, there would be no safe bombing run. Bombers would fly directly through towers, chimneys, cables, and anti-aircraft fire. Inside the cockpit of a bomber from the 44th Bomb Group, the pilot could already see bursts of black smoke rising ahead. German radar had finally detected the incoming aircraft. Air raid sirens began sounding across the refinery complexes. Fuel workers scattered across the industrial yards. Gun crews ran toward their positions. The American bombers were now only 3 minutes from the first target. Then the first heavy flak battery opened fire. A black explosion burst directly in front of the lead aircraft. Another detonated just below the wing of a trailing bomber. At this altitude, even a small fragment could rip through fuel tanks or control cables. And the worst part of the plan was still ahead. To reach the refinery cracking towers, the bombers would have to fly straight through the center of the industrial complex, less than 300 feet above the ground. The first wave had just crossed the refinery perimeter, but the navigation error had scattered the attack groups across several different directions. Instead of one coordinated strike, the bombers were about to enter the most heavily defended oil complex in Europe, one group at a time. August 1st, 1943, 7:40 in the morning, directly above the Columbia Aquila refinery complex, Ploiesti, Romania. The first American bombers descended even lower. Pilots reduced altitude to nearly 150 feet, attempting to line up with the refinery cracking towers. At this height, the aircraft were flying below most heavy flak prediction systems. But the advantage came with severe risk. The refinery complex was a forest of steel. Distillation towers rose 200 feet into the air. Pipes crossed above rail yards. Power cables stretched between chimneys. Storage tanks formed narrow corridors that forced the bombers into predictable paths. Inside a B-24 Liberator of the 98th Bomb Group, the bombardier watched the target approach through the Norden bomb site. The aircraft flew at nearly 280 miles per hour. At this speed, the bomber would cross the entire refinery in less than 15 seconds. There would be only one chance to release the bombs. On the ground, German and Romanian anti-aircraft crews opened full fire. 88mm guns fired point blank into the formation. At such short distance, the shells did not need timed fuses. Direct impact alone could tear apart a bomber wing. 37mm cannons fired rapid bursts from rooftops and rail platforms. Tracer rounds streaked across the refinery sky like glowing wires. Within seconds, the sky above the refinery became a crossing web of gunfire. A bomber from the 44th Bomb Group struck a smokestack while attempting to evade flak. The wing clipped the structure, and the aircraft rolled violently into the refinery yard. Another Liberator from the 93rd Bomb Group took a direct hit to the fuel tank. The aircraft continued forward for several seconds before erupting into flames, yet many crews continued their attack runs. Lieutenant Lloyd Hughes of the 93rd Bomb Group approached the Astra Romana refinery, one of the largest fuel processing facilities in the region. German defenders had flooded parts of the refinery with fuel oil and ignited it. Walls of fire rose between the storage tanks. But Hughes continued the bombing run. His aircraft was already leaking fuel from previous flak hits. Flames trailed behind the wing as the Liberator crossed directly above the refinery cracking towers. At 7:44 in the morning, the bombardier released the bomb load. The bombs struck the refinery processing units and storage tanks. Several distillation towers collapsed within seconds, but the aircraft could not escape. The leaking fuel ignited fully. The bomber descended into the burning refinery complex moments after the bomb release. Across Ploiesti, other bomb groups were facing similar chaos. Because of the earlier navigation error, several formations attacked the wrong refinery complexes. Some bombers circled briefly while searching for correct targets. Each additional second inside the defense zone increased their exposure to concentrated anti-aircraft fire. Romanian fighter aircraft from nearby bases were also scrambling to intercept. Messerschmitt Bf-109 fighters from the 53rd Fighter Wing began climbing toward the low-flying bombers. However, the altitude difference limited their ability to dive quickly into the formations. The primary danger remained the ground defenses. Several refineries had installed hidden anti-aircraft guns disguised as industrial machinery. Some weapons were concealed inside rail cars positioned near storage yards. When the bombers entered the refinery corridors, these guns opened fire at extremely close range. Despite the resistance, many bombers reached their targets. Explosions ripped through pipeline networks. Oil storage tanks erupted into towering columns of fire. Thick black smoke climbed thousands of feet into the sky above the city. The Steaua Romana refinery suffered heavy damage to its cracking units and pumping stations. The Romana Americana complex lost several major fuel tanks and pipeline junctions. But the cost to the attacking force was severe. By 8:10 in the morning, the surviving bombers began leaving the target area. Many aircraft were heavily damaged. Some had lost hydraulic systems. Others had engines failing after flak strikes. The return flight to Libya still required more than 1,000 miles of open water in hostile territory. Several bombers would not make the journey. Out of the original 178 B-24 Liberators, more than 50 aircraft were destroyed during the mission. Hundreds of American airmen were killed, wounded, or captured. Yet the question that now faced Allied planners was even more critical. Had the raid actually crippled the oil production of Ploiesti, or had the refinery complex already begun repairs? Because if the oil kept flowing, the German war machine would continue moving across Europe. And the next phase of the air campaign would have to become far more relentless. August 2nd, 1943, 10:30 in the morning, Ploiesti Industrial District, Romania. Smoke still drifted above the refinery fields. Repair crews from the Romanian Oil Engineering Corps and German industrial specialists moved cautiously through the shattered complexes. Steel beams twisted across the ground. Cracked pipelines leaked thick black fuel into drainage canals. But something quickly became clear. The damage was severe, yet it was not permanent. Within hours of the raid, emergency crews had already begun restoring several pumping stations. Temporary pipes replaced shattered lines. Electrical technicians reconnected power systems using backup generators. German planners had anticipated such an attack long before the American bombers arrived. Months earlier, the German Ministry of Armaments, under the direction of Albert Speer, had ordered extensive redundancy systems installed at Ploiesti. Critical refining components were distributed across multiple facilities rather than concentrated in a single plant. This meant that even if one refinery was damaged, others could continue processing crude oil. By late August 1943, several of the damaged facilities had already resumed partial production. The Astra Romana refinery restored limited output within weeks. The Columbia Aquila complex repaired several distillation units using replacement components shipped from Germany. The immediate strategic effect of Operation Tidal Wave was therefore smaller than Allied planners had hoped. However, the raid revealed something far more important. Ploiesti could be hit. For nearly 3 years, the oil fields had operated as a protected industrial fortress deep within Axis territory. Few Allied aircraft had ever reached the region. But now the strategic map of Europe had shifted. The United States Army Air Forces had demonstrated that long-range bombers could reach the heart of the Axis fuel network. By 1944, the air war had changed dramatically. New air bases in southern Italy, captured after the Allied invasion of the Italian mainland, placed Ploiesti much closer to American bomber formations. Aircraft from the 15th Air Force, including B-24 Liberators and B-17 Flying Fortresses, began launching repeated high-altitude bombing missions against Romanian oil production. Unlike the single low-altitude strike of Operation Tidal Wave, these new missions involved hundreds of bombers flying in heavy formations, protected by long-range fighter escorts, such as the P-51 Mustang. Each raid targeted specific components of the oil system. Some bombers struck cracking towers that separated crude oil into usable fuels. Others attacked rail junctions used to transport refined gasoline toward Germany. Storage tanks, pipeline hubs, and power stations became priority targets. On April 5, 1944, more than 200 American bombers attacked the Ploiesti refineries in one of the largest strikes of the campaign. Additional raids followed throughout the spring and summer. The cumulative damage slowly began to break the oil network. Production statistics reveal the scale of the impact. In early 1944, Romanian refineries produced roughly 5 million tons of oil products annually for the Axis war economy. By late summer 1944, after months of repeated bombing, production had fallen dramatically. Several refineries were no longer able to operate continuous cracking processes. Others suffered electrical failures that halted fuel distillation entirely. German armored divisions on the Eastern Front soon began experiencing severe fuel shortages. Panzer units often received only partial allocations of gasoline for training or maneuver operations. Luftwaffe fighter groups reduced flight hours because aviation fuel reserves were shrinking. Even transport trucks carrying ammunition and food across Eastern Europe began operating on limited fuel schedules. The strategic chain reaction had begun. Without reliable fuel, mechanized warfare became slower and less flexible. The German army relied heavily on rapid armored movements to stabilize collapsing front lines, but tanks without fuel were simply armored targets. In August 1944, the strategic situation reached a decisive turning point. Romania changed sides in the war and joined the Allied coalition. German forces were suddenly cut off from the Ploiesti oil fields entirely. Within days, German engineers destroyed portions of the remaining refinery infrastructure during their retreat, but the larger damage had already been done by the air campaign. The Axis had lost its most important external source of petroleum. From that moment forward, the German military would fight the remainder of the war under permanent fuel scarcity. Aircraft missions decreased, tank movements became limited, strategic mobility across the European theater steadily weakened. The bombing that began over Ploiesti in 1943 had not destroyed the oil system in a single day, but it had exposed the vulnerability of the Axis fuel network. And once the Allied air forces understood that weakness, they returned again and again until the oil fields could no longer sustain the war machine they once powered.